everybody. So, Kierkegaard, an insane amount of vowels. He was Danish, and I always feel like his name needs to be said with a pirate accent. Kierkegaard! It's just, I don't know, to me it just screams for that sort of pronunciation. So forgive me for indulging myself. And feel free to just refer to him as a capital K on your writing on the discussion board and the quizzes for this week if you don't want to have to spell it out perfectly every time. So Kierkegaard, 1813, 1855. We're getting more and more and more recent. So pretty soon we're going to be, pretty much all caught up historically. Kierkegaard is our first look at the branch of philosophy called existentialism. You have a breakout definition of this. Existentialism is the branch of philosophy that deals with aspects of existence, right? Which is the existential part. The root, obviously, is existence. Now, most of the philosophers that we've been looking at have been dealing with very big sorts of questions. Truth, knowledge, how do we know that the world is how it appears? How do we know anything for certain, right? How do we gain knowledge when everything's changing? And then we saw some ethical viewpoints with Mill and with Kant telling us what we should be doing. We saw Marx criticize our economic system and use philosophy to try to have a practical output on a real problem. And here with Kierkegaard, we're going to get even more personal. And we're going to, not only in the same way that Marx's poverty influenced his worldview, Kierkegaard's personal life dramatically affects the way he viewed everything. So existentialism is the branch of philosophy that deals with things like, do we have free will? And what is the meaning of our existence? Is there a purpose in life? And if so, what is it? And is it the same for everybody, or do we get to decide that for ourselves? What happens when we die? Why do we die? And that's Ginger, by the way. Right? Questions like this. Awareness of your own mortality, right? And a lot of people who are traditional college age go through what we call an existential crisis, where you realize that your life is your own, and you realize that the choices that you make are important ones, and you realize that in a lot of ways, every door you open closes doors behind you, and that you're going to die, right? Have you realized this? Every single person you've ever even looked at your whole life, everybody you've ever seen, is going to die, including you, and including all of your favorite people on the planet. Right? Everybody's going to die. Some people soon, some people late, but we're all going to die, right? That's a pretty heavy thing to come to terms with. And if you can come to terms with it, then you're probably going to be a lot better at not being afraid of it and making the most out of your time here, right? So existentialism deals with these sorts of questions, and this is our first real look at it. We're going to get a little bit more of it, but it's definitely something that I can point you towards some things if you want to read more about it. A lot of people love existentialism. So, Kierkegaard criticized, and we're going to see several people do this as well. Kierkegaard criticized philosophy, everything up until him, because he thought that they were missing the point. Because he thought that philosophy up until that point had tried to tell us what I should think, what I should believe, what ideas I should have. But he said that the real important thing is not any of that. The real important question is, what am I to do? Give me something that I can live and die for. I'm not going to live and die for Platonic forms. I'm not going to live and die for Kant's categorical imperative. I'm not going to live and die for an idea about what truth is. Right? I want something that's that important to me and to my existence that I'm going to live for that purpose, and I'm willing to die for it too. And that's a pretty tall order to fill, because there are very few things that most of us would say that we'd live and die for. Probably people that are important to you, especially if you have family and children and all of that, I'm sure. Religious beliefs, for a lot of people, are about the only beliefs they would live and die for. Maybe a social movement, equality, justice, right? Something like that. Politics, maybe. Right? People are willing to die for that. Patriotism. People are willing to die for their country. Obviously, the military depends on that. So But really, there's not a whole lot. Like, I personally love Cheetos. I'm not going to die for Cheetos, right? If there were no more Cheetos in the world, I'd be a little bit bummed out. I'd get over it, right? And keep living. So, Kierkegaard was looking for something that he could live and die for. And he thought that philosophy had completely failed in trying to answer this, which to him was way more important than anything they had been working on. So, one huge thing in Kierkegaard's worldview that affected the way he looked at everything else was this idea of an either-or dichotomy. And a dichotomy is like when there's only two choices, right? So either or. It's either this or it's that. And it can't be both, and it has to be one or the other, right? He has a whole book called Either Or about this, which a lot of the stuff from this chapter comes from that. If you want to read it, it's a big, thick book, and it's really interesting to get through. But it's worth the investment. There's also an Elliott Smith album called Either Or, if anybody's a fan of him, that follows the same sort of existential ideas. So, this starts with the story of Abraham and Isaac from the Bible. Kierkegaard was an extremely devout Christian, and he belonged to a branch of Christianity that was popular in where he was living at the time, in the time period, but it didn't really have a whole lot of lasting effect on all the different denominations of Christianity. It's not like Catholicism or a Baptist or Lutheran or a Methodist or like one of the big ones that still persists to this day. And it was also required, right? People were required to go to church, and that affected the attitude of people a lot, right? When people can freely choose whether or not they want to worship and how, they're going to have a very, very different mentality about their religious beliefs than if people are forced to go to church and are forced to worship in a specific way and are forced to believe a specific set of things. So, Kierkegaard looks at, and I feel like he criticizes religion a lot, and Christianity in particular, and I feel like it's very easy to look at that and just assume that he was like this atheist and whatever, and he wasn't. Like, he was trying to save his religion from what he thought was corruption, and what he thought was a bastardized version of it that was insulting to God. So, Abraham and Isaac, if you don't know this story. So, Abraham was sort of the godfather of the Jewish faith. And God had told Abraham and his wife, Sarah, were unable to have children. And they really wanted children, and they couldn't have children for whatever reason. But God promised Abraham that he was going to be the father of a humongous lineage of chosen people who went on to become the Jewish people. But it wasn't happening, right? And he had faith in God that he was going to be the father of like this whole thing and the patriarch of the whole, group of people, but it wasn't happening. She wasn't getting pregnant. So, sort of side tangent to this story, he ends up getting their slave, Hagar, pregnant. She gives birth to a son named Ishmael. There's no word in the Bible of whether or not this was consensual, and if she wanted to have sex with him or bear his child, or whether she was a slave, it didn't matter what she wanted. He had the rights to do whatever he wanted. But he has Ishmael, and then Sarah, his wife, actually ends up pregnant. And so he basically says, oh, thanks for coming out, Hagar. I appreciate you giving me Ishmael, but like, we're done here now that I have a legitimate kid with my wife. And he sends Hagar and Ishmael out to wander the desert. And they're basically not heard from a whole lot more in the Bible, in the Jewish or the Christian faith. However, in the same way that all Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham, all Muslims trace their lineage back to Ishmael. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam are all very, 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 very connected. So, back to the part that Kierkegaard was obsessed with. He has Isaac. He's finally this child that he waited a very long time, right? I mean, people in the Bible lived supposedly a lot longer than people now, so they were like well past childbearing years when this happened. So he has Isaac and loves Isaac, the child that he always wanted, and the fulfillment of the destiny, whatever. And then God tells him, hey, I want you to kill Isaac. And at the time, Jews were required to make sacrifices to God, animal sacrifices. And there were very strict regulations for what sorts of animals, for what sorts of sins and transgressions, and whatever. But God wanted blood sacrifices. And not human sacrifices. That really wasn't part of it until now. God tells him, kill Isaac. Now, Abraham's thought is, but this is my only kid, right? But he was faithful enough to God that he was willing to do this and to be obedient. So he takes Isaac out. He is about to sacrifice him when he is stopped. Isaac is spared, and now obviously the Jewish people are numerous, and it seems like that destiny and prophecy was fulfilled. Now, this story obsessed Kierkegaard, and we see it in a lot of places. The first is in his idea of this either-or dichotomy. Abraham had to choose God or Isaac, and he couldn't have both. Because if he chose Isaac, he'd be disobeying God. And if he chose God, he was going to kill Isaac. And here's what happened. He chose God, and God rewarded him, and he was able to have both. So the moral of this story for Kierkegaard is, I have options, I have to choose. Each choice should eliminate the other one, right? Every door that gets open closes the door behind you, right? Closes your other options. So, you have a whole bunch about his relationship with Regina, which is fascinating. And one of the most interesting things to me about the way your book presents it is that Kierkegaard was, I believe, 27, and she was described as a very attractive 14-year-old at the time, which, right, I mean, that age difference seems very problematic nowadays. Back then, apparently not so much. But he really thought he fell in love with Regina, he was going to marry her, and all of this stuff, and then he really got obsessed with this idea that he couldn't have both God and Regina, and that he had to pick one. And that if you choose one, you have to go all in and give everything you have. So he thought that if he tried to have both, he would be a crappy husband and a crappy Christian. Because he had to make a choice and devote all of his love and his time and his energy into that one thing, whether that was God or whether that was Regina. And that either one eliminated his ability to really have the other. Now, a lot of modern-day Christians will say that, if they and their spouse both believe in God, that it makes their faith stronger and all sorts of things. But Kierkegaard wasn't on that mentality at all. And he really thought that he had to choose. Now, what he ends up doing is breaking off the engagement, breaking off his relationship with Regina, and choosing God. And then because of the Abraham and Isaac story, he sort of thinks, God will reward me. And in the same way that Abraham was rewarded by Isaac's life being spared, because of his faithfulness to God, he thought that God would reward him and that he would be able to have Regina too. Well, maybe God didn't tell Regina that's what was happening, because she eventually moved on, and it remained devastating for Kierkegaard, and he spent the rest of his life wondering what if. Like, what if he made the wrong choice in choosing God, right? She was the one that got away. And I think that it's really easy to romanticize relationships that never really got the chance to get to the point where you maybe realize that it's not, right, the best fit, or that you could live without that person, or whatever it is. I mean, if you have this really powerful, intense love, and when it's still all giddy and perfect and you don't even know what you don't like about them yet, if it ends, it's really easy to forever assume that that would have been your soulmate or whatever. But who knows what would have really happened. But this idea really permeated with Kierkegaard that you had to choose. And for him, God was the only logical choice if we really want to consider ourselves to be true Christians. And maybe you don't, but this is still a very different perspective on Christianity than you're going to get probably from any living Christian nowadays. And we're going to see how it gets even weirder. So part of Kierkegaard's beef with religion and with Christianity in particular was that he thought that any sort of identity that one gets or grows from a collective group was inauthentic. So if I get my religious identity and beliefs from an organized religious institution or church, that's inauthentic. If I get my political identity from just identifying with a group and saying, oh, well, I'm Democrat, so I'm just going to agree with whatever Democrats say. And I'm going to join the party, I'm going to go to the rallies, and right, that's who I am now. Inauthentic. A social movement. If I try to get my identity from a subculture, right? Whatever that might be. I'm a hipster, I'm goth, I'm punk, I'm whatever, right? Inauthentic. Because he thought that the only way to be authentic was to actually be a unique individual. And if I get my identity and my beliefs and my purpose from other people, that I'm sacrificing a part of myself to do that. That it's somehow false. It's somehow me just trying to shove myself into a box that I don't perfectly fit in, right? So if you remember those things when you're a kid and there's different holes in different shapes, and then you have the little plastic things of the various shapes and you have to try to figure out, right? It's one of the earliest things that tries to teach spatial reasoning to children. I'm sure you had it. Your kids maybe have it if you have kids, right? So you find the circular peg that goes through the circular hole. Well, when kids are trying to figure this out, they try to jam the wrong shape in the wrong hole, and sometimes you can kind of get it stuck in there or whatever, or get it through if you really push on it. He thought that's what happens when we try to find our identity and our purpose and our beliefs and our ideas and our opinions from identifying with others, from getting that from other people, that we're trying to shove ourselves through a hole that we don't quite fit through, and that we're doing a disservice to ourselves. And this can be small scale things like looking to society to tell you what you should look like or how you should dress or what kind of music you should like or not like, or if you're basing everything, right, all of your beliefs about what your purpose in life is and what's right and wrong and what's going to happen when you die, right? If you base all of this off of, well, I identify as this and that's what they believe, right? He thought that was a very inauthentic way to live. So in the same way that we had eudaimonia from Aristotle, we had species life and alienated life in Marx, here we get authentic and inauthentic existence. And for Kierkegaard to believe something and to exist, it wasn't just like, oh, I'm alive, I exist, right? It referred to a very like alive awareness sort of existence. And for a belief to really even be worthwhile, it had to be so impactful that it totally changes the way that you would live if something was different. So, for instance, I believe that, I don't know, kale is good for you. Okay, well, if I believe that kale was bad for you, would that really change anything about how I live my life? No. I would probably just not eat kale, right? That's not going to be some huge life-altering. I'm a totally different person now with different priorities. But if I believe that, Christianity is true, then if that belief is going to be real and authentic, it better change the way I live. And being a Christian versus not being a Christian, your life better play out differently, depending on which one of those camps you're in. And if it doesn't, and for a lot of people it doesn't, right? A lot of people maybe consider themselves Christian, maybe go to church every once in a while, Christmas and Easter, right? They grew up with it, they don't really practice it, but they still identify as it. There are people that, like, if they just weren't Christian, it really wouldn't affect the way they live. It really wouldn't make them a totally different person. Same thing with their political viewpoints. Maybe I vote, but maybe I don't really care. Maybe I don't really pay attention, right? If you could change those beliefs and it really wouldn't dramatically alter who you are and how you live your life, then those beliefs are inauthentic, according to Kierkegaard. And then we get to stages of life. So we have the aesthetic stage, which is what everybody is in until they're at least probably out of college for the most part. And this is when we're just seeking as much pleasure as possible. We're selfish. We're motivated by what we think is going to fulfill us, whether that is a bodily pleasure or whether that is a sophisticated intellectual pleasure. Our life is really just about that, and we don't really have a whole lot of concern for how our actions affect other people as long as they make us happy. And then if we progress from that, we get to the ethical stage, which is when we start caring about how our actions affect other people, and we develop a system of what we think we should and shouldn't do. And most people will get this system from their religion, from a philosophical viewpoint. We've already seen Kant and Mill, which a lot of people follow. From, I don't know, you make it up yourself, you get it from the government or from your culture or society, wherever it comes from, we develop an ethical system. And Kierkegaard thought most people stop there. So in psychology, you're going to get a whole bunch of different stages of life with detailed explanations for each one. Kierkegaard's really only going to say most people, there's only two. You only worry about yourself and being happy, and then you start worrying about other people. And you'll sacrifice your own happiness if you think that it's wrong to obtain happiness in that way. If I do progress from this, I get to the religious stage. And I think that religion is the wrong word for him to use here, because he really didn't like institutionalized religion. So he wouldn't say like, oh, this is when you start going to church, right? No, because that could be very inauthentic. Instead, the religious stage, which almost nobody ever gets to, is a blind leap of faith towards God. A lot of religious people try to prove God's existence. We saw this with Descartes and with Thomas Aquinas, which is the chapter that we skipped over. A lot of people think we need to be able to rationally try to prove God's existence. And Kierkegaard said, no, you shouldn't even try, because you can't, and it defeats the entire purpose to try. The whole point of it is that it doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It's absolutely absurd, and that's why you should believe in it. So not only does the religious stage require no rational evidence or justification, but he actually thought we needed to forget about the ethical stuff in order to do it. So think back to Abraham. If Abraham had been an ethical man, when God said, hey, kill your kid, he would have been like, no, screw you. Right? Because murder is usually the most wrong thing we can think of. It's hard to imagine doing something worse to anybody than killing them. Killing a kid seems like the worst kind of murder. And killing your own kid, it's hard to find anything worse than that from a moral standpoint. So if he had been an ethical man in the ethical stage, living consistently with his ethical viewpoints, there's no way he would have been willing to kill his kid. That's like the most wrong thing you can do. But instead, he took all of those ethical beliefs about right and wrong, and he put them aside, and he just took a blind jump towards God and said, I'm just going to trust that this is going to work out. And he was willing to kill his kid. Now, God intervened and stopped it, but Abraham had to trust, right, that it was going to work out for him. And that he had no rational justification for being willing to kill his kid. He had no rational justification for why God would tell him to kill his kid after telling him he was going to have this huge legacy, right? He had no rational justification for any of that. What Abraham did was insane. And it's also interesting that people look to that story as a good example of how much faith and obedience we should have in God. And Kierkegaard certainly took it that way in a dramatic way. But I think that it's interesting to consider if somebody nowadays tried to kill their kid and said God told them to, we'd probably lock that person up in an insane asylum, right? And we probably would say, no way God told you to kill your kid. That's insane, right? Why would God want you to kill your kid? That doesn't even make sense. God doesn't want you to murder anybody, especially a child that you're supposed to protect, right? And I think even a lot of religious people would believe that there's no way God would tell this guy to kill his kid. So it's interesting. I don't know how much that's society and time changing, or if it's just when it's an old story in the Bible, it's hard to imagine it being a real person and a real kid in real circumstances. So in order to get to the religious stage, we have to forget all the rationality, all the ethical stuff, and just make a blind leap towards God. And he thought that was the only authentic kind of faith in God. Right? Now, you don't have to agree with this. You certainly, I'm not going to tell you that your religious belief is terrible in comparison to this, or that you have to agree with Kierkegaard about it. But I think it's a very, very interesting way to look at Christianity in particular, and any sort of institutionalized belief system. A lot of people think, right, well, if I identify with a religion and I have a community and I can share that with people and practice with people and learn from others, like that seems to be a really positive way of figuring the world out for myself. Well, Kierkegaard is going to disagree. And it's up to you whether or not you agree with him, but I think it's certainly all really interesting and worth thinking about.